Hello, and thank you for joining us today for this Waste 360 webinar sponsored by Chevron Lubricants. My name is Mallory Shapansky, and I'm the Editorial Director for Waste 360 and the moderator for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to say a few words about this webinar technology. This platform allows our audience to be more involved with the presentation and, more importantly, allows you to watch this event the way you want to watch it. To begin, feel free to customize your webcast console. You can move windows around by dragging on the title bar or resize your windows by clicking in the lower right corner of any window. You will also notice a toolbar at the bottom of your console. These buttons allow you to open and close widgets on your screen at any time. We also invite you to get social during this webinar. If at any time during our session today you hear something interesting, feel free to tweet it to your followers using the Twitter widget. Also, if at any time you experience difficulties with the audio or advancing of the slides, simply press your F5 key to refresh your webinar console. You can also submit questions at any time during this webinar. All the questions will be asked and answered during the Q&A portion at the end of this webinar. You can also download the slides for this webinar by clicking on the folder icon on your screen. You can do this during the webinar and it won't interrupt the presentation. We appreciate your feedback, so please click on the red survey icon and complete the form. Before I introduce today's presenters, I would like to hand it over to Dan Holdmeyer, Industrial Sector Brand Manager for Chevron, to say a few words.
Thank you, Mallory. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining today's webinar. As Mallory said, my name is Dan Holdmeyer. I'm the Chevron North America Industrial Sector Manager for Chevron Lubricants. I've worked at Chevron now for 19 years, and I've had 39 years overall in the lubrication industry. I am a chemical engineer by training, and in my years at Chevron, I spent several years working in the waste hauling sector with OEMs, equipment managers, and maintenance managers. One thing I have learned is that for an operation to be successful, to run smoothly, a strong preventive maintenance practice is key. Preventing downtime is invaluable to your operation. Not all maintenance practices are created equal. It's good to stay current on what the experts recommend, not only on maintenance, but on productivity. So we've approached the publishers of Waste 360 to create a webinar on best practices for waste haulers. I hope you find this informative and helpful to your business. I will turn the mic back over to Mallory. Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. Now I'd like to introduce today's presenters. The first presenter is Michael E. Hoffman of Stiefel, and the second presenter is Christopher Lyon, Director of Fleet Relations at NTEA. And with that, I will let Michael take over and begin his presentation.
We slides. And
If everybody could please just give us a moment. It appears we're having a little bit of technical difficulties with our speaker's mic. So bear with us and we'll be on shortly.
Okay, Chris, we're actually going to let you present your slides, and then we will go back to Michael once we can get his audio working. So at this time, we will start with Christopher Lyon giving his presentation.
Good afternoon, all. My name is Christopher Lyon. I'm the Director of Fleet Relations for the NTEA. I've been with the organization for about 4 years now. Prior to that, I spent 10 years in municipal purchasing, as I see from the attendees. We kind of have a bunch of fleet people from all across the industry. So as we all know, especially on the municipal and vocational side, we see a lot of specialized equipment. So data is one of the most important aspects when it comes to vocational vehicle design. As we know, vocational trucks are designed and built for specialty purposes, and they often require a great deal of upfitting and modification. So many off-the-shelf designs require upfitting. We're going to discuss the importance of making data-driven decisions when designing vocational trucks. A little bit about the NTEA. We were established in 1964. We're the Association for the Work Truck Industry. We represent more than 2,000 companies that manufacture, distribute, install, sell, repair commercial trucks, truck bodies, truck equipment, trailers, and accessories. Now, buyers and users like yourself of the work truck industry are also part of the NTEA. We put on an annual event on the Work Truck Show every year. There's an opportunity to view new product launches as well as amazing networking opportunities. So we provide a whole bunch of technical support. We're an advocacy for government relations, and then we provide detailed statistics and market data for analysis. So trucks, often these are purchased and outfitted without adequate research and planning. This leads to higher maintenance costs and shorter useful lives, if not specified properly. It's important to fully understand how these vehicles are used, and this begins with good and accurate data. And I really need to emphasize the importance of accurate data. If our data is wrong, then we're in a worse position than flying blind. Data is the basis of decisions that we rely on from day to day. Now, this goes from vehicle design, daily operations, to fleet right-sizing. Often, fleet managers have a great handle on their operations. We know our fleets. We understand our fleets. We have that great gut feeling, and most of the time we're right. However, if we have data is non-biased, data is verifiable, and data does not lie. Now, this goes a long way when working with stakeholders, especially when it comes to the financial branch of your organization. Data allows you to have a verifiable resource when making decisions on vocational truck design. Where do we find data? There are several types of data, and data can come from many sources and can be applied over many avenues. This can, as Dan was talking about, this can affect maintenance intervals, component and utilization. Collecting data on component failures and looking for trends can put you in a position to do some predictive maintenance. But we all know that there are components that have a finite life and eventually wear out. Identifying and replacing these items before they wear out can reduce downtime. As we know, unscheduled downtime is the most expensive downtime. In my tenure as a fleet manager, going to our users, or in some cases, our internal customers, we often feel pressured on vehicle utilization. We go to the users, we ask them, hey, do you need this vehicle? And the answer is always yes. We use it every day. We use it all day, and we use it every day. We have good data, whether that comes from telematics, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, we can actually look at utilization trends. Are vehicles being overused, overutilized, or underutilized? Can we do some fleet right sizing? Did we design the right vehicle for the right task? The vehicle's not being used or is underutilized, more cases than others, it doesn't do the job that the user needs it to do. So where do we get data? You know, if you're a small fleet, the most basic thing is fuel records. You know, that gives us, you know, how much we're using vehicles. Maintenance records. Again, we can start looking at trends for component failures. Let's replace these before they fail. Let's actually design a preventative maintenance schedule based on usage. You know, a lot of times, you know, it was simply we did maintenance when vehicles were available, but now we can actually schedule. But what do we do with this data? It's important that it's evaluated. You know, looking at data and digesting it, this can create specification changes. You know, I encourage everybody to get out into the field and see how people actually use equipment. You know, start collecting some of your own data. You know, data doesn't necessarily come off, you know, a CAN bus or a computer system. Oftentimes, how those of us in the office envision operators using our equipment does not coincide to actual usage. Like, that also gets into operator training. Do we have skilled and trained operators? You know, when we don't, we often see improper use. Another thing is we can identify needs of maintenance. A lot of times we have policies in place, and it's important to have that. But are we doing more maintenance than necessary? Again, looking at that vehicle utilization schedule. One of the most important things is to understand is drive and duty cycle. You know, drive cycle defines how a vehicle is utilized, whereas a duty cycle defines how much or how often a vehicle is utilized. So, in basics, a drive cycle is a graphical representation of a series of data points, and this can represent maximum speed, average speed, starts and stops, PTO time, power export time, and it shows us how our vehicle is being used. Your organization probably has multiple drive cycles, whether this is seasonal, suburban, or a rural area, and this can affect your vehicle application. So, as we talked about, duty cycle is how much and how often. Now, this is where you ask your users, you know, how much do you use the vehicle on standard responses all day, every day? Now, if we understand this data on this duty cycle, it really shows how and when they use the vehicle. That creates, you know, a graphical platform when going into vehicle utilization, total miles driven. You know, we can even start plotting: are we loaded or empty? And this is going to bring us into, you know, making some data-driven truck design decisions. So, like everything, we keep historical data. This allows us to look in the past. You know, a lot of fleet managers take out their spec and polish it off and update for the next purchase cycle. So this can be a lost opportunity. We look at how the truck was used. Was it underutilized? Was it overutilized? You know, what was our total cost of ownership? And did we overextend the requirements for that truck? Well, it's back to horsepower. General rule was if if you didn't have the performance, we just added more horsepower. That tends to get very, expensive very quickly. We can start looking at one of the easiest things to do is look at powertrain optimization. Again, going back to that drive cycle is what is our maximum cruising speed? What's our required starting rateability? What does this thing need to do? And all that can be charted and go into your vehicle design. Another thing is alternative fuels and technology. Looking at, especially in the waste hauler world, with a lot of stop and starts in urban environments, there's several technologies out there that can help with launch assist. And we can start looking at is there an ROI for some of these advanced technologies? So telematics, kind of getting more advanced. This is something we can use as an active tool. So this provides one biggest thing is idle management reduction. Idle time is just that, the vehicle's idling and doing absolutely nothing, burning fuel. So that's one piece of low-hanging fruit we can work on with active telematics. So the most unpredictable thing is the human factor. And it's even compounded when we're putting people in 80,000-pound vehicles going down the road. And we do some real-time driver feedback. You can start seeing how your employees are using these vehicles, and is there any behavior modification that needs to be done? Inventory management. If you're hauling cargo, there's telematic opportunities to know when, what, and where certain inventories are, and even go as far as calculate the approximate weight of what we're loading on trucks. Maintenance optimization. This is if we're having an engine trouble code, it can actively alert you guys, and you can make a maintenance arrangement before you have a catastrophic failure, and again that downtime. But probably the most important thing is the importance of quality materials. Extremely important to follow OEM standards, especially when it comes to fluids and lubricants that need to meet or exceed OEM standards. And with that, I'm going to hand this back over to Mallory, and hopefully we got Michael back on the line, and we can go from there.
So
Michael,
hopefully everyone can hear me. I
yes,
can hear
we
you
can hear you.
and see my slides. Terrific. So,
Awesome.
So my objective this afternoon is to bring you up to speed on the state of the industry, touch a little bit on where we are in China, talk about internal inflation as it relates to this data issue and how the industry is starting to use data to manage cost controls, and where it ties all in, and then we'll conclude. So as a quick summary on the state of the industry, and this would be the slide 6 on the screen, we're in a position where solid waste is in a very good operating environment. We've got a positive GDP that's running somewhere between 2.5 and 3.5. CPI's finally broke back through 2%. Housing starts are on a pace that's, call it 60 to 70,000 a year, and it doesn't peak until 2020, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Following behind that, you have household formation driving really good new business formation. So the non-res construction cycles are going to be up at least almost 3.5% in 18, and it's actually tracking slightly faster than that through the first 5 months of the year so far. It doesn't peak till 2021, and you have the consumer is engaged in the economy, and be careful what you hear all of the talking heads say on the financial news media. You know, the garbage can is showing that the consumer is out in the marketplace. What should that lead to? Well, all in all, the garbage industry is looking at 2 + 2 growth, 2% price, 2% volume, and then you get into individual companies and market mix and market selection, and that flexes it. The guidance this year's got us somewhere between 2 and 3.5. I wouldn't be surprised if the 3.5 is raised to 4% before we're done. Volumes are running between 0 and 2.2, and the 0 is really a reflection of discretionary choices about exiting non-profitable or unsafe business. Tax reform was a big deal for the C Corps. All of you who operate as a C Corp know that. And even the pass-throughs were benefited by some of the changes in tax reform. How's that money being spent? Interesting enough, it's being husbanded at the moment with some incremental capital spending pulling out that older but still useful truck that still had some residual life left. Maybe you're tweaking that out or making upgrades into break rooms and locker rooms to refresh the working environment that the drivers and mechanics are interfacing with to help improve some of that retention issues. Recycling clearly is a hit in 2018, but we'd tell you we think the bottom has been touched. It levels out, and this washes itself in 18 and becomes a non-event. In 19, from a financial standpoint, many of the bigger operators would say they hope it stays low. Maybe that will finally drive their customer to the table to have an honest conversation about recycling. We'll touch on that a little more. And then the deal activity has shown itself to be extraordinarily good. This looks like, to me, what the late 80s and early 90s look like with the number of private companies that are interested in selling. So the state of garbage is very good. So let's touch on housing for a second as we think about what's going on. That's your next slide. So this next slide is meant to give you a visual of how to think about housing over a 60-year period. And to set it up for you, the gray bars are recessions. The red line is the housing, total housing starts in the United States from back in the late 50s through current period. The solid blue line is the long-term median, and then the shaded areas is standard deviation. And then the next slide, well, let me frame this. So notice how in all recessions, how sharply the red line rises all the way up until this last recession. This is an important data point to think about because how the garbage industry reacted to all prior recession and housing start cycles post-recession is that a lot of activity would occur. You'd put equipment to work quickly, and then price would follow it. Well, this current housing cycle, which is the next slide shown in more detail, shows you that we haven't even gotten back to the long-term average, let alone the demographically driven demand number, which is around 1.5 million to 1.6 million. So we're in this very slow, gradual recovery in housing. What would that do into the garbage industry? Well, one of the things that's really important to note is one of the largest players at the peak of housing in this slide had about 18,000 trucks on the road. Today, that same company with almost $2.5 billion more in revenues has 16,000 trucks on the road. What happened is they got a lot more productive, and they turned those assets smarter. Well, one of the issues they had to address to do that was fleet availability, fleet reliability. So it came down to maintenance. Well, part of that came down to data. What did you collect to be able to monitor what was happening to the truck so you could determine could you get in front of a maintenance issue instead of reacting to a maintenance issue? And that brings me to sort of our next point. Let me thread China in if I can very quickly. This is real. This is different from the previous periods where China used its purchasing power to drive pricing down. They are absolutely on an environmental mission. Part of the agenda here is to drive out the really low quality, high polluting small paper mills in China and concentrate the rest of paper making into a handful of bigger operators. And as a result, they are not kidding about the quality standards. They're not kidding about taking actions that will disrupt the flow of fiber into the small buyer and ultimately concentrate the buying into the larger operators like Nine Dragons and Lee and Man and the like. The other issue, though, comes back to this side, is that, okay, so we're now facing lower commodity prices. That's our reality. The truth is that we have mispriced this business for 30 years. And will this be the opportunity to finally correct it? that you'll often hear in the marketplace, well, we fixed the processing end. And to the degree that a third-party user is coming into someone else's MRF, they're paying now an appropriate fee in most cases for what it costs to process the recyclables plus a reasonable margin. Cost of processing is $100 to $120 a ton. 6 months ago, it had gotten as low as $65 to $80 a ton. So we've clearly raised the cost of processing because of what China's done, and we're charging for that in some cases. But it's a tiny percent of the volume. Most of the volume is impacted by what happens at the collection side of this relationship. And there we are way undercharging. On average, nationally, it's $4 a house per month. It ranges between $3 and $5 a house per month. That number, if you're truly recycling, ought to be at least $7 to $8, maybe even closer to $10. And if we're diverting, it ought to be greater than $10 a month. And that's the major issue that the garbage companies are looking for, the bigger companies. Can we get the customer to the table to have an honest conversation about what it really costs to recycle and build that back into the pricing structure over time? The data, interesting enough, is suggesting that if you ask a customer, the homeowner, do you want recycling? They go, absolutely. And then when presented with, well, instead of paying $20 a month, you're going to pay $30 a month, they go, oh, no, I'll put it in the trash. And they don't, in fact, have a true willingness to pay. And that will be an interesting part of this process as we work through the dynamics of we're undercharging, the economics are broken, and will the industry be able to find a path to fixing it? So now let's come back to this inflation issue. Labor is 30% of your cost. Wages are up 5 to 10%. If a truck breaks down and you now have incurred unproductive overtime, you have sent out another truck out there, you can see what's happening to labor and what it does to inflation. Fuel's 4 to 5% of total cost, and fuel prices are up almost 20% year over year and continue to rise through the years. Oil prices continue to creep up. And with the latest pulling out of the Iranian nuclear deal, that's only put upward pressure on crude oil prices, which will put upward pressure on fuel. Again, a productive, highly effective operating truck impacts absolutely directly the fuel consumption. One of the main areas is to think about lubrication. If you don't have an engine that's operating at the highest point of efficiency, the lubrosity of that engine oil is going to have a direct impact on the quality of that fuel economy. And so one of the things I've seen the industry do is starting to move away from traditional oils into more synthetics, trying to get much more yield out of that oil, so maintain the higher quality to do fewer oil changes, lower cost, but also that higher quality oil improves the lubrosity, which improves fuel economy. Maintenance expenses are 10 to 12% of the cost of doing business. And the inflation on maintenance for the last almost decade has been far greater than the underlying internal inflation of the business itself, which has been running at 2 to 2.5%. Only recently, really in the last sort of 3 to 4 years, have you seen the industry and the bigger players really wrap their arms around this issue in an effort to try and control not only the inflation of their maintenance, but also the predictability of the maintenance process. And moved away from reacting to maintenance. The truck broke down, now what do I do? To preventive maintenance, let's anticipate. Let's use data to understand, are we starting to see indications of wear and tear or performance issues coming off the truck that would indicate we should actually pull it in and do a maintenance cycle. And increasingly, you're starting to see the OEMs provide data resources on the vehicle, sensors and the like, that can be managed, and either they can pull the data off in the abstract, in the aggregate, and then ship it off to you to use, or they can actually manage that data for you and give you information that would tell you everything from you have a driver in a residential area that's trying to do 10-second start-stops and is accelerating to 30 miles an hour and then braking, and their fuel economy is terrible, versus the driver who's doing 10-second start-stops and it's accelerating to about 20 miles an hour and then stopping, is much better fuel economy. All of that can be used to improve the quality and performance of the business, but more importantly, manage your costs. And then the third-party transportation for the companies that are running transfer stations, that's where you're aggregating volume and putting it into tractor trailers and moving. You're seeing pretty healthy cost inflation there. And it's a pretty high percentage of the cost of doing business, 13 to 15%. So as we think about all of this and what it means to the industry, they're managing costs from using data to try and improve productivity, fleet availability, reliability, and then they're driving real price in an effort to help mitigate incremental inflation beyond what they can't offset through productivity itself. What we believe you'll see is increased efforts to use that data to raise fleet availability, go to preventive maintenance from reactive, better labor utilization, not only from route rationalization, but also keep the truck on the road more consistently. There was a period in time where a driver would get in the truck and 20% of the time the truck would break down. We've now gotten that back under 10%. It helped to manage safety. Data also helps you see when there's bad behavior that could lead to incidents. This is the 5th most dangerous occupation in the United States, and can we reduce that? And then lastly, I think where you'll see data being deployed is the Internet of Things, where you have better customer engagement. Bringing this to a conclusion, state of garbage is very good. There is real pricing leverage, and it's sustainable, and now rising CPI is going to help that. China definitely is not kidding, and this is not about price. It's about the environment in China, and they are going to keep the pressure on to drive out the high polluter, small operator, concentrate on the fiber side, more production into bigger but fewer operators. There is a demand cycle here that supports why paper will be exported, but we're still working through the subtleties of having this influence to drive out that inefficient paper maker. And then trash has embraced technology. You see it on the truck today, but you'll see it increasingly used more and more with customer engagement, and you'll see more and more data coming at the operator to help to improve this, again, fleet availability, lowering maintenance costs, managing inflation by getting better equipment utilization, managing your labor. With that, I'll hand it back to Mallory.
Thank you, Michael. We will now start the Q&A portion of this webinar. Once again, if you have a question, feel free to add it and ask it down at the bottom of your screen. Michael, there's a couple questions that came in for you. You highlighted that maintenance and repair is 10 to 12% of costs in the solid waste business. Can you talk a little bit about that and how managers can ensure that they are properly managing those costs?
Well, I think the biggest issue is, do you have a standard set of practices on how you do maintenance? And so if I give the extreme, pulling a truck in to do work on the brakes, so you're doing the same workflow sitting in Washington, D.C. as you would be in San Francisco. And in doing so, have you figured out the most efficient, effective approach to this? What parts need to be in place in inventory so that you manage that technician mechanic's time well? I think the other side of maintenance that the industry that I see with the bigger public companies and the bigger privates is this idea of being much more vigilant about preventive maintenance. You have lower life cycle costs with a preventive maintenance program than you do to reactive maintenance. And I think the third item that is interesting is study and track the use of OEM versus aftermarket. I'm not saying that you should only use OEM. I'm not in that camp at all in that context. But study your data and figure out, did you really get a savings by using aftermarket parts within your equipment? Track that part number to a VIN number on a truck, and then really track the life cycle of the part. Did you find yourself saving 50% on the cost of the part, but replacing it 3 times as often? And at the end of the day, you didn't actually save money. On the other hand, there are plenty of aftermarket parts that are very good, but figure that out. I think that's the other subtle piece, that if you can get that balance right of what's OEM versus aftermarket. And then on the lubricant side, don't kid yourself that you're saving your money because you're stretching the life cycle of your lubricant. There is a lot of data. And our hosts here today, not because they're our hosts, but they certainly could share a lot of it, but there are lots of base lubricant manufacturers and finished goods lubricants companies that can share with you a tremendous amount of information of when the additive package starts to break down, under what conditions, and what that does to a host of maintenance-related issues, not the least of which is fuel, but also just the life cycle of the engine and what that means to it. And don't cheat on your lubricants package just because you think you can stretch the life and save money. I get it. There's $2,000 worth of lubricants and hydraulics in a truck every time you change them. But it has an awful lot to do with the operating performance of the vehicle too, and maximize that, don't minimize it.
Right, and you also touched on, some of the recent moves coming out of China, and obviously technology is entering this industry at a fast pace. How do you think that technology can improve some of the struggles that the industry is currently faced with?
Well, so China has to be broken up into a couple buckets. So when we were at Expo this year, the Chinese news media interviewed me, and they asked me a question about how the U.S. service providers were reacting to the 0.5 contamination standard. And I looked at the reporter and I said, well, can you help me with something? Because is 0.5 because the Chinese paper maker, we're going to focus this on paper, because the Chinese paper maker was saying, hey, we can't operate our plants effectively if we have contamination greater than the 0.5. Whereas in reality, we could, in fact, set the standard from the Chinese government at 1% because the paper makers can operate at 1%. And the journalist looked at me and said, well, that's an awfully rational question. I said, well, if it's the latter and 1% really is it, then let it be 1%, because then you get what you need, which is a cleaner fiber, but we get what we can do, which is meet your need. So that's one side of it. The other side of it is, I don't think anybody in this equation has had an honest conversation with each other. And the garbage operators are guilty 30 plus years ago for responding to their customer, principally a municipal customer, who said, I want recycling, and went, sure. Never really thought about the economics, added a price per month to do it. And we really haven't moved away from that ineffective pricing structure since. And in between, the customer then started conning their taxpayers that they were really recycling when in truth they were diverting. And the garbage companies would tell you today, I don't really care if you divert or you recycle, but if you're going to divert, it costs more. And if you're going to recycle, then it's a different cost because you'll have less residuals. And this comes down to what's in the bin. So where I see technology playing a role is, does the garbage operator, the truck going down the street, put it in front of that household technology, simply an app, that would allow them to communicate about what really belongs in the recycling bin. Just because that recycling label is on a piece of material, a good, a product, doesn't mean it necessarily belongs in that particular bin. And can the garbage industry regain the education side of this by using technology to interface with the customer and have an honest conversation about what's reusable and can be reused back into a circular economy? Because if you really get down to the root of it with the residential or the homeowner, that's what they want to see, is sustainability, not that it could all go in there and therefore it doesn't go into the landfill first and only ends up back in the landfill eventually.
All right, thank you. And our next question is for Dan Holdmeyer. Can I assume that when oil is first delivered or fresh out of the pail, that it's clean and meets the OEM requirements? If not, then what should I do?
That's a good question. It relates a lot back to what Michael was just talking about regards to maintaining the equipment and trying to minimize your overall cost and optimizing your reliability and uptime. You cannot assume that the oil that comes out of your drum or out of your bulk tank, although bulk tanks tend to be cleaner than drums, and pails are fairly clean too. But they still don't meet the cleanliness level, particularly in the hydraulic system for those directional valves, and some of them have the P70 valve that operates the ram, the side load arm, etc. And I don't know if the audience necessarily knows the ISO cleanliness code. As an example, it needs to be a 17, 15, 12, refers to particle counts in the 4 micron, 6 micron, and 14 micron size particles. These are small particles that you cannot see, but they get wedged in between the valve spool and the valve body and cause erratic operation besides wear. Typically, you might see in a bulk situation something in the order of 18 or 19 versus 17 and 15 and below. So quite a bit more contaminated in the drums. It tends to be a little bit more dirty just because of the process of cleaning those oils or those drums before they're filled. And every time you transport oils, they have a tendency to get contaminated. And the idea is to deliver it clean and then keep it clean. It's about 1/10 the cost to keep it clean, keep dirt out of it, versus allowing the dirt to get in there. I'm currently in Minneapolis at the Society of Tribology and Lubrication Engineers. I'm a lubrication engineer, not that tribologist, very detailed study. But there was a presentation on a paper where someone studied the cleanliness level of oils, cleaning the fluid, meeting the OEM specification, and just regular oil out of the drum. And they run it through a bench test and monitor the wear on the pump itself and the valves. And although the filters on the system did clean up the oil eventually, there was severe damage done on that pump prior to it getting clean to the OEM specification. And so much so that it resulted in cavitation and even some drop off in oil pressure in the system. And if we went allowed to go further, all that dirt and debris floating through those hydraulic systems, particularly on the hoses, can berate the inside of those hoses, causes leakage, and causes problems that way. So I guess short answer to that is no, you cannot rely on it coming out of the drum to be as clean as it needs to be, and there are ways to clean it up before it goes into there, or buying cleaner oil in different forms and put it in there, but then you have to maintain the cleanliness too once you get it in there. Thank you for the question. That's a good one.
Sure. And there's actually one more for you. Some of my new equipment is coming with SAE 10W30 API FA4 oil in the engine. Do I need to carry 2 engine oils to meet these new requirements?
That is a good question. This new API category came out in December of 2016, I believe. All these years are slipping by quickly, so I think it's 2016, maybe it's 2017. But they've gone to the API CK4 and FA4. And now the CK4 oils are the ones that are backwards compatible with previous requirements. If you had an API CJ4 oil meeting the requirements of your engine, the CK4 would meet that requirement. Same way it would meet the CI4 and other previous oils. FA4 oils are only going to be an XW30, so a 5W30, a 0W30, or a 5W30. And they're designed to help the OEMs meet their fuel efficiency requirements, or actually the carbon footprint of their entire fleet. So they've designed their engines to handle these lower viscosity oils and meet that fuel economy. You can utilize an CK4 oil, 10W30 or 1540, in place of the FA4 oils. So you do not need to carry multiple oils for your engines. As long as your fleet has a good mixture or more modern engines that will handle the 10W30, or you can still go to the 15W40. But getting back to what Michael said, you want to look at your fuel economy. Where's the trade-off there? If you have very few engines or old engines that not too worried about the life of that, you could switch your entire fleet to the 10W30 if those newer engines allow a 10W30, but you do not have to maintain the FA4. I would recommend the API CK4 and look at the synthetic blend products. They do give you longer life and they give you better wear protection in those engines versus the traditional API CK4 and older oils. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Our next question is for Chris. Spring is finally here. What actions should companies be taking to get their fleets ready for the warmer months?
That's an excellent question. So, as our seasons change, and well, I'm from the Midwest, so we finally got out of winter last month, and so depending on your regions, fleets should be transitioning from snow flooding equipment, putting that into storage. As we know, the summer months can be, hot, so just taking into account that we're summarizing specialized equipment for long-term service. Also we're bringing out equipment out of winter storage that may not have been utilized over the winter season. So obviously fluid should be checked, but most important, an in-depth kind of out-of-storage seasonal inspection. Most importantly, inspecting brakes, things that have been sitting for several months tend to, just be with lack of use. So it's important to, go over that inspection. We're putting employees in our vehicles, so we want to make sure we're providing them with the safest and most regulatory compliant tool for them to use.
Great, thank you. And another question for you, what recent technologies have you seen come online that make managing maintenance easier?
Another excellent question. And I'm going to agree with Michael on oil changes, and it becomes, very expensive on large trucks. Oil analysis has come a long way, and I believe Dan probably has a whole lot of data to back this up, but starting to sort of build a baseline of your, specific oil that you use, you can create a profile of when to change oil. Obviously, most importantly, follow the manufacturer's recommendations, but in some severe duty cycles, we may want to change that to tailor your needs. Another thing is, telematics continues to advance. We have gone way beyond GPS and geofencing. We can now provide real-time diagnostics to alert fleet managers to possible problems before they turn into larger problems. And another wonderful thing on telematics is we can provide real-time feedback to operators and identify those high-risk operators and do some corrective training before there's a larger problem.
Great, and just going off that, what advice do you have for managers and companies that are looking to try out one of these new technologies?
First off, it's important to fully understand your organization's mission and operational positions. Understanding that, you'll be in a good spot to evaluate all different types of options, depending, what your organizational mission is. Some of that is carbon footprint reduction. Others is alternative technology based on a specific market segment. Secondly, in the fleet world, especially with new technologies, it's difficult to be the pioneers on that. But the wonderful thing about fleets is we often do not view ourselves as competitors, and we normally share, experiences, both positive and lessons learned, and specification changes, as well as informational resources. There's also several organizations like the Clean Cities Coalitions that have resources for new technologies coming out, and as well as possible funding opportunities.
Great, thank you. And our next question is for Dan. Where should we buy the oil product, from a blender or from a company like Chevron?
Well, of course, it's just a company like Chevron, I would say, but just make sure that the product meets the specifications of the OEMs and that you are getting consistent quality products, and that the OEM spec that you're looking at is current. I've had some examples, not so much in the waste hauler industry, but sometimes in the agriculture industry, folks out there selling like a John Deere 303 fluid or their tractor hydraulic fluids. And it is not a current specification. So it meets an OEM specification, but that's been obsolete since the 70s. So that's just one example of that. And if you were to open up some of those buckets, those are not consistent whenever you open it up. So make sure you do vet your supplier, make sure that they have products that meet those specifications and have some history of performance out there. And I guess one of the biggest things too is make sure that they can deliver on time, which is a big critical success factor. And finally, if you're looking at keeping your hydraulic systems running efficiently and long time, make sure they deliver in a clean, meeting the OEM's requirements. Not everyone can do that. Not everyone will stand behind their recommendations or their products meeting that specification. You may pay a little bit more up front for the clean oil, but it's a lot cheaper keeping the dirt out versus removing it from the system itself. And it does create much longer life of those hydraulic components and much smoother operations for your operators out there doing the daily grind. So do some homework, ask the questions about what kind of cleanliness level will you deliver my hydraulic oil, and what do we know about the engine oil specifications. Have them review your fleet to make sure they know what your fleet requirements are, and they'll make the recommendation on what product should be used in there. It's not just a matter of saying, okay, I've got this oil, it's 1540, here you can use it in your entire fleet. There are differences in the equipment, what they require, but also, as Chris was just mentioning, review your own personal or your company objectives. If you want to look for that fuel economy, you might be looking at 10W30 for a majority of your fleet. If you're not so worried about that, you're working in a hotter environment, you might want to stay in a 15W40. So some things to discuss with your supplier and ask them some serious questions about what you're doing and what their recommendation would be and how they can meet your requirements. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Those are all the questions at this time. And before we sign off, I'd like to thank our presenters as well as our sponsor, Chevron Lubricants. And I would also like to remind everyone that the webcast on-demand version will be available on the Waste 360 website within the next 48 hours and will be available for 1 year. Thank you so much for attending, and I hope you have a wonderful remainder of your day.